The morning Susan Dalton rode into Crestfall, Texas on the back of a borrowed mule with nothing but a carpetbag, a cast iron skillet, and a letter of employment. She had no idea she was riding straight into the most complicated and wonderful thing that had ever happened to her in her 26 years of living. The year was 1878, and the land around Crestfall was the kind of beautiful that punished you for admiring it too long. The flat stretches of golden grass rolled out toward distant limestone ridges, and the sky above was enormous and relentless, blue in a way that made a person feel very small and very free at the same time. The town itself was modest, a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Red Anvil, a church with a crooked steeple, and a post office that doubled as the telegraph station. Dust settled over everything like a second skin. Susan had come from Abilene, where she had spent 3 years working in the kitchen of the Cattleman's Hotel until the owner sold the place, and the new proprietor decided he preferred male cooks on account of what he called efficiency. She had taken her dismissal with the kind of quiet dignity that hid a deep and simmering fury, packed her things, and answered the first advertisement that seemed promising. That advertisement had come from a cattle ranch called the Double C, located 4 miles outside of Crestfall, and it had read simply, "Experienced cook needed. Room and board provided. Fair wages. Inquire Monroe Carson, Crestfall, Texas." She had written back, received a brief but courteous reply that said the position was hers if she could cook a proper biscuit and not complain about early mornings, and had made the journey south in the spring of 1878 with the optimism of someone who had survived enough difficult years to know that things could always, improbably, turn out better than expected. The first person she encountered when she arrived at the Double C Ranch was not Monroe Carson. It was a wiry, sun-browned young man named Pete Aldridge, who was mending a fence post near the main gate and squinting at her arrival with open curiosity. "You the new cook?" he asked, setting down his hammer. "I am," Susan said, climbing down from the mule with a practiced ease that came from years of making do. "Susan Dalton, I have a letter from Mr. Carson." Pete Aldridge's face did something that Susan could not quite interpret. His mouth curved into a small, knowing sort of smile, and he nodded slowly, as if something had just confirmed what he already suspected. "Yes, ma'am. I'll take you up to the house. Boss is in the barn with the new horses." The ranch itself was impressive in the way that hard work made things impressive, not grand or ornamental, but solid and purposeful. The main house was a 2-story timber structure with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The bunkhouse sat to the left, and beyond it were 3 large barns, several paddocks, and the kind of organized sprawl that spoke of a working operation that had been built carefully over many years. Cattle moved in the distance, slow and indifferent. Pete led her to the barn, and that was where she first saw Monroe Carson. He was tall, which was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was the way he moved, which was deliberate and unhurried, the way a man moves when he is completely comfortable in a place and has no need to prove it. He was standing beside a bay gelding, running his hand along the horse's flank with a practiced gentleness, speaking in a low voice that Susan could not hear from the barn entrance. He wore worn denim trousers, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and boots so broken in they had become part of him. His dark hair needed cutting, and there was a day or 2 of stubble on his jaw, and when he looked up at the sound of their footsteps, Susan saw that his eyes were a shade of brown that was very nearly amber, like light coming through a glass of whiskey. He was 31 years old, and he looked like someone had carved him specifically for this landscape. "Mr. Carson," Pete said, "your cook is here." Monroe Carson looked at Susan Dalton with an expression that was careful and measured, the kind of expression a man wears when he is trying very hard not to have an expression. He came forward, wiped his hand on his trousers, and extended it. "Miss Dalton, good to meet you. I hope the journey wasn't too rough." "It was fine," Susan said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but not performative about it. I've made worse trips. Good. He studied her for a moment in the frank, unself-conscious way that people in the West often studied each other, assessing character and capability the way you might assess a horse or a stretch of fence line. Kitchen's in the main house. I'll have Pete show you to your room. Hands eat at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. I take my meals at the same time with the crew. Lunch is informal, whatever's available. Any questions? How many men on the ranch? Susan asked. 8 hands full-time, sometimes more during roundup. Plus myself. He paused. I should mention the men are a decent lot. They'll treat you respectfully or they'll find themselves looking for work elsewhere. I appreciate that, Susan said, and she meant it because she had worked in enough kitchens to know that was not something every employer thought to say. Monroe nodded once and turned back to his horse, which Susan recognized as a clear but courteous dismissal. She followed Pete Aldridge to the house. The kitchen was extraordinary. It was the largest kitchen she had ever worked in outside of a proper hotel. A wide, airy room with 2 cast-iron stoves, a long preparation table of heavy oak, shelves lined with proper equipment, and a door that opened onto a back porch where herbs grew in clay pots with the determined resilience of things that were well tended. Someone had cared about this kitchen very much. Who was the last cook? Susan asked Pete as he showed her to the small but clean room off the back of the kitchen that would be hers. Pete's face did that thing again, that small, knowing smile. Mr. Carson's mother. She passed 2 years back. He's had 3 cooks since then, all of them men, and none of them lasted more than a few months. Why not? Couldn't cook worth a lick, Pete said cheerfully. Mr. Carson is a patient man about most things, but bad food tries his patience something considerable. Susan set her carpetbag on the bed and looked around the room. It had a single window that faced east, a washstand with a white basin, a small dresser, and a rag rug on the plank floor. It was the nicest room she had occupied in 3 years. I can cook, she said simply. Pete grinned. Yes, ma'am, I expect you can. She proved it that very evening. She had examined the larder and the root cellar in the afternoon, with the systematic thoroughness of someone taking stock of a new territory. And by 6 o'clock, she had produced a supper that made 8 tired, sun-baked men go very quiet in a way that was less like silence and more like reverence. There was a beef stew thick with root vegetables, biscuits that were golden and layered and light in the way that great biscuits are light, a pot of pinto beans with smoked salt pork, and 2 dried apple pies that she had assembled with the speed and confidence of someone who had made 1,000 pies and knew exactly what she was doing. The men filed in from the bunkhouse, found their seats at the long dining table in the main room, and when the food was set before them, the eating was serious and grateful. Monroe Carson sat at the head of the table, and Susan watched from the kitchen doorway as he took his first bite of the stew, and something crossed his face, something that was not just satisfaction but something closer to surprise, and underneath the surprise, something that she could not name but that made her look away quickly and turn back to her stove. After supper, Monroe Carson came to the kitchen. She was washing up, and she heard his footsteps before she saw him, a measured, unhurried tread that she was already beginning to recognize. "Miss Dalton," he said. She turned. "Mr. Carson." He was quiet for a moment, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and there was something almost reluctant in his expression, as if the words he was about to say were ones he had not expected to have reason to say. "That was the best meal that has been served in this house in 2 years, he said. "I want you to know it's appreciated." "Thank you," she said. "I'll do better when I've had a chance to take full stock of the larder and make a proper shopping list." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "Looking forward to it," he said, and then he was gone. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that Susan found surprisingly easy to settle into. She rose before dawn, built up the kitchen fire, and had coffee and biscuits and eggs ready when the hands came in from their first chores. The days were long and full, and she found that she did not mind the work. She had always been someone who drew satisfaction from feeding people well, from the alchemy of raw ingredients becoming something that nourished and comforted. The Double C's kitchen gave her more scope for that than she had ever had before, and she took to it with something close to joy. The hands were exactly as Monroe had described them: decent. There was Pete Aldridge, who was 23 and incurably cheerful, and who had a gift for finding humor in the most unlikely situations. There was a quiet, serious man named Hector Reyes, who had come up from Chihuahua 10 years earlier, and who spoke little but observed everything and was, Susan quickly determined, the best horseman on the ranch by a considerable distance. There were brothers named Clay and Emmett Voss, who bickered constantly and affectionately, and who were both equally devoted to their older sister who lived in San Antonio, and to whom they sent a portion of their wages every month. There was a former Union soldier named Thomas Webb, who was 52 years old, and who had settled into ranch work with the composed pragmatism of a man who had made peace with his past, and simply wanted to do useful work in a quiet place. And there were 3 younger men, Jesse Park, Arlo Finn, and a tall, raw-boned Texan named Dutch Coulter, who were all in their mid-20s and who treated Susan with a combination of respectful deference and barely concealed delight, the way men who eat well treat the person responsible. They were not subtle about their appreciation. They complimented her food with enthusiastic specificity. They brought things to her without being asked: firewood, water from the well, the first tomatoes from the kitchen garden when summer came on. They touched their hats when they passed her and spoke to her as they might speak to a respected neighbor. And every one of them, Susan noticed within her first 2 weeks, had a particular expression they wore when they looked between her and Monroe Carson. It was the same expression she had seen on Pete Aldridge's face the day she arrived, a knowing, quietly delighted look, the look of people who had reached a private conclusion, and were simply waiting, with considerable patience, for the facts to catch up. Susan chose not to think too hard about what that meant. Monroe Carson was not an easy man to know. He was not unfriendly, but he was private in the way that men who had spent years alone in a demanding landscape often became private, accustomed to his own company, cautious with words, generous with actions in a way that he seemed unaware of. He kept the ranch in excellent order. He was fair and direct with his men in a way that earned genuine loyalty rather than just compliance. He worked as hard as any of them, harder on the difficult days, and he did not ask anyone to do something he would not do himself. He was also, Susan discovered gradually and somewhat reluctantly, deeply thoughtful in ways that caught her off guard. The first indication came 3 weeks after her arrival. She had mentioned in passing to Pete Aldridge that she was running low on certain spices. Not a complaint, just an observation, as she planned to send a list to the general store in town. The following afternoon, Monroe Carson returned from a supply run to Crestfall with a paper parcel that he set on her kitchen table without comment. Inside it were 4 glass jars of spices, every single one of which was on the list she had been drafting in her mind, but had not yet written down. He had somehow known what she needed before she had said it. She found him in the barn that evening. "Mr. Carson, the spices." "Figured you were getting low," he said without looking up from the harness he was mending. "I hadn't mentioned it to you. Pete might have said something," he said, and the way he said it was so carefully casual that she knew Pete had said nothing of the kind. She stood there for a moment, looking at the side of his face, at the line of his jaw and the quiet concentration in his expression, and she felt something stir in her chest that she decided, firmly and immediately, to pay no attention to. "Thank you," she said. "Part of the job," he said, "making sure you have what you need." "Right," she said. "Good night, Mr. Carson. Good night, Miss Dalton." She walked back to the house in the warm June evening with the clear conviction that she was going to be in a considerable amount of trouble before long if she was not very careful. The summer arrived with the full authority that West Texas summers carried, enormous and hot and relentless. The sky bleached to a pale blue by noon, and the heat rising off the land in visible waves. The ranch work intensified with the season. The summer roundup required extra hands, and the double C swelled temporarily to 15 men, and Susan's kitchen became a full-scale operation that she managed with the organized efficiency of a military campaign. She hired a girl from town named Berta Sandoval for the month of the roundup, and the two of them fed 15 hungry men 3 times a day with a consistency and quality that generated a reputation that traveled, as things do in small communities, far beyond the ranch itself. Neighboring ranchers commented on it. When a cattle buyer from Dallas came to do business with Monroe in July and was invited to stay for supper, he told Monroe afterward that he had not eaten that well since his last trip to New Orleans, and Monroe had said, with a simplicity that Susan later heard reported to her by Pete with enormous relish, "Miss Dalton is a remarkable cook." And every single ranch hand within earshot had smiled. Susan was sitting on the back porch one evening in late July, after the supper dishes were done and the kitchen was clean, watching the sun go down over the western pastures in the particular spectacular fashion that the Texas sky accomplished sunsets, when Monroe Carson came around the side of the house and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Your porch," she said. "I asked anyway," he said, and came up the steps and leaned against the porch railing with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way men do when they are thinking about something they are not sure how to say. They were quiet for a while. The sun worked its way down, painting everything amber and rose, and the cattle lowed somewhere in the distance, and the evening insects began their chorus in the grass. "You going to stay on?" Monroe asked eventually. She looked at him. "The position's only through the fall, that's what the letter said." "I know what the letter said." He was looking at the sunset, not at her, and the amber light was doing something to the planes of his face that she found very distracting. "I'm asking if you want to stay on. Permanently. The position would be permanent if that's what you wanted." Susan was quiet for a moment because this was a question with several different answers depending on how she interpreted it, and she was not entirely sure she was prepared for all of those answers. "I'd need to think on it," she said. Monroe nodded, as if that was exactly what he had expected her to say. "Take whatever time you need." He put his hat back on and straightened up. "You've made a difference here, Miss Dalton. I want you to know that." He went back inside, and Susan sat on the porch for a long time after the sun was fully down, listening to the crickets and trying to be very honest with herself about what she was feeling, which was more complicated and more pleasant and more frightening than anything she had felt in a very long time. The incident with the storm changed things. It came in late August, the kind of fierce, fast Texas thunderstorm that builds on the horizon with dramatic speed and arrives with complete conviction. The men had been out in the north pasture all day, and Susan had spent the afternoon watching the sky with the wariness of someone who had lived in this part of the country long enough to know what green-tinged clouds meant. By late afternoon, she had the feeling that settled like a stone in the chest, the particular unease of someone who can see a problem coming and cannot stop it. The storm hit at dusk with a violence that rattled the windows and drove hail against the walls of the main house like rifle shot. The men came in from the pastures in groups, soaked and breathless, and Susan had the kitchen roaring and coffee hot and food ready with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that wet, cold, worried people needed feeding immediately and before anything else. All 8 hands accounted for. She counted heads the way a mother counts children. Monroe was not among them. Pete Aldridge was stripping off his soaked jacket in the entry hall, and she caught his arm. "Where is Mr. Carson?" Pete's face went tight. "He was checking on the horses in the north barn when it hit. The road between there and the main house crosses the creek, and the creek was all ready." He stopped. "We don't know." Susan did not deliberate. She pulled on the oilskin coat that hung by the back door. It was Monroe's coat, far too large for her, the sleeves falling past her hands, and grabbed the lantern from the hook. "Miss Dalton," Pete said, alarmed, "you can't go out in this." "Someone has to," she said, and she went out the back door into the storm. The rain was extraordinary, a physical force, not just water but weight and sound and disorientation. She kept her head down and her lantern close to her body to protect the flame, and she walked with purpose toward the north end of the property, using the fence lines to guide herself. The lightning came in great blue-white explosions that were terrifying and useful, illuminating the landscape in sudden perfect clarity. She found him at the creek crossing. Monroe had made it most of the way back but had misjudged the creek, which had come up fast in the storm, and caught the edge of the embankment where he was crossing. He was on the near side of it, sitting in the mud with his back against a cedar post, his left hand pressed against his temple where the blood was being washed away as fast as it came by the rain, conscious but clearly dazed. "Mr. Carson," she said, kneeling beside him and raising the lantern to see the cut on his head. It was not deep. She determined head wounds bled dramatically regardless of severity, but the confusion in his face was concerning. He had struck his head on something, probably when the bank gave way beneath him. "Miss Dalton," he said, with a bewildered specificity, as if her name were the one solid thing in the current situation. "Can you stand?" she asked. "I believe so," he said, and she helped him up, getting her shoulder under his arm, and they walked back through the storm together. The tall, broad-shouldered rancher leaning some of his considerable weight on the woman who was too small for his coat, and completely unafraid of the storm battering them both. They made it back to the house. Pete and Dutch Coulter were on the porch and came down to help, and Monroe was brought inside and seated in the kitchen, where the light was best, and Susan cleaned the cut on his head and determined with the practical competence of someone who had grown up in a household where the nearest doctor was 20 miles away that it did not require stitching. Monroe sat very still while she cleaned the wound, which was something that required her to stand very close to him and focus entirely on what she was doing, and she was aware, with a peripheral clarity that she tried very hard to suppress, that he was looking at her face with an expression that she could not bring herself to examine. "You came out in that storm," he said quietly while she was working. "Someone had to," she said, which was the same thing she had said to Pete. "You could have sent one of the hands. They were already wet and tired, and I was the one who noticed you were missing." She finished cleaning the cut and stepped back, which created a more comfortable distance between them. "You should rest tonight. No riding tomorrow." Monroe looked at her for a moment with that careful, measured expression she had come to know well, and behind it something that was warmer and more transparent than he probably intended it to be. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and went back to the stove. Behind her, she heard Pete Aldridge say something very quietly to Dutch Coulter, and though she could not make out the words, she heard the tone of it, amused and fond and knowing, and she kept her back very straight and her face very composed and told herself she was concentrating on the soup. The autumn brought the cattle drive preparations, and the ranch became a place of intense, concentrated purpose. Monroe was in constant motion, managing logistics, negotiating with buyers, overseeing the sorting and branding of cattle before the drive north. Susan fed the operation, which meant expanding her production considerably and organizing the cook wagon supplies for the hands who would be making the drive, while keeping the ranch house running for the reduced crew staying behind. It was during this busy, practical, largely unromantic period that things between Susan and Monroe Carson became, quietly and incrementally and entirely without either of them making a deliberate decision about it, something different from what they had been. It started with small things. He began taking his morning coffee in the kitchen instead of the dining room, sitting at the end of the preparation table with a cup, and going over his cattle tallies and ledgers while she cooked. He did not talk much during these sessions, and neither did she, and the silence between them was the comfortable, easy kind that people only achieve when they are genuinely at ease with each other. Occasionally he would ask her something, not about cooking, but about her opinion on something he was reading, or about Abilene, or about what she thought of the new cutting horse he had acquired from a ranch outside of San Angelo. And she would answer directly, with the honest and considered manner that she had always had, and he would listen in that particular way of his, with complete attention, as if what she said mattered to him. She began leaving a second cup on the table in the mornings without being asked. He began, without comment, keeping the wood box beside her stove reliably full, which had previously been Pete's job but which somehow transitioned, through no obvious arrangement, into Monroe's. The hands watched all of this with the patience of people watching a particularly interesting play unfold, maintaining their knowing expressions and saying nothing about any of it directly, which was its own particular form of collective wisdom. In October, Monroe came back from Crestfall with a crate in the back of the wagon that he carried into the kitchen himself without help, setting it on the preparation table with the careful manner of someone handling something they do not want to damage. "For the kitchen," he said, and left. Susan opened the crate and found, packed in straw, 12 glass mason jars in 2 sizes, a new set of measuring spoons made of proper tin, and at the bottom of the crate, wrapped separately in cloth, a cookbook published in 1876 by a woman in Boston, the pages edged in gilt, and the cover stamped with a design of herbs and kitchen implements. She stood in the kitchen with the book in her hands for a long time. That evening she sought him out in the study, which was a room she had not often entered, his private domain, lined with ledgers and maps and a few books on cattle management and land surveying. He was at his desk, writing, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "The crate," she said, "the cookbook. I thought you might like it," he said. "The woman at the bookstore in Crestfall ordered it for me." He paused. "It took longer than I expected. How long have you been waiting for it?" He looked at her steadily. "Since June," he said. Susan stood in the doorway for a moment longer, and then she said, "Thank you, Monroe," and used his name for the first time, and watched something in his face shift very slightly and become less guarded. "You're welcome, Susan," he said, and used hers and went back to his writing. She walked back to the kitchen with the book held against her chest and the very clear and no longer suppressible knowledge that she was thoroughly, helplessly, and completely in love with Monroe Carson, which was, she reflected with a kind of rueful clarity, quite the development for a woman who had come to this ranch, intending to simply cook and collect a fair wage, and ask for nothing complicated. November came in cold and clear, and the cattle drive crew returned from their successful run north with money in the ranch's coffers and appetites sharpened by weeks of trail cooking. Susan's welcome-back supper, a proper Texas barbecue with beef brisket and all its accompaniments, followed by a pecan pie she had been planning since October, achieved the closest thing to a religious experience she had ever produced in a kitchen, judging by the expressions around the table. Monroe sat at the head of the table as always, and at the end of the meal he raised his coffee cup in a gesture that was more instinctive than ceremonial. "To Miss Dalton," he said, "who keeps this ranch running from the inside." To Miss Dalton. The hands echoed with genuine enthusiasm, and Pete Aldridge was grinning so broadly that his whole face was involved. Susan, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder, felt her face go warm in a way that she very much hoped was not obvious in the lamplight. After the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, Monroe came to the kitchen again. It was a habit now, this end-of-day appearance, this standing in the doorway or sitting at the table while she finished the last tasks, these conversations that had grown gradually longer and less carefully constructed over the months. "You've made up your mind yet," he asked, "about staying on?" She had been considering her answer to this question since July, and the fact that she was still here in November was itself an answer of sorts, but she understood that he was asking something more specific than whether she wanted the job. She dried her hands on the dish towel and turned to face him. "I have a question first," she said. Monroe, leaning in the doorway, looked at her with an expression of careful attention. "When you put that advertisement in the paper," she said, "what were you actually looking for?" The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture. Monroe straightened away from the doorframe, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is deciding between several degrees of honesty and settling on the fullest one. "I needed a cook," he said. "That part was true. And the other part." He looked at her with those amber-brown eyes that she had spent 8 months studiously trying not to think too much about. "My mother used to say that a ranch runs on 2 things, good cattle and a good table." She meant it literally, but she also meant something else by it. A home is a different thing from a house, and I had a house. He paused. "I'm not saying I put that advertisement out with any particular plan in mind. I'm saying that when you arrived, I knew within the first week that you were someone, not just something that I didn't want to lose." The honesty of it was startling. Susan had expected careful deflection, the cowboy's habitual retreat from sentiment, and instead she had received something direct and real and slightly frightened, the way true things are sometimes frightened of themselves. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The expression that crossed his face was so open and so unguarded that she felt she was seeing something she had not been meant to see, or, more precisely, something that had been kept carefully behind glass for a long time and had just now been allowed out. "Susan," he said. "Monroe," she said. And they looked at each other across the kitchen in the lamplight, the cast-iron stove warm between them, and everything that had been building since May settled into something clear and unambiguous and very still. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she met him halfway. And when he kissed her, it was with the same quality that characterized everything he did, deliberate and unhurried, warm and completely certain of itself. And she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart going as fast as hers, and thought, with the part of her mind that was still observing the situation from a practical distance, that they had both been working toward this for quite some time, and it was an enormous relief to have arrived. He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his expression was something she had no word for, something between wonder and rightness. "I've been wanting to do that since July," he said. "What happened in July?" "You sat on the back porch in the evening light and disagreed with something I said about the cattle market with complete confidence and total accuracy, and I realized I had never met anyone in my life I wanted to talk to more." Susan laughed, which was not the response she had expected to have to that statement, but it was genuine, and it made his face do something extraordinary. He smiled, a full and unguarded smile that she had never seen on his face before, and that she immediately understood was something he gave out very rarely and very deliberately, and it was the most attractive thing she had ever seen. "I should go," she said, because propriety and the practical realities of her situation in his household were both real considerations that did not evaporate simply because she very much wanted to stay exactly where she was. "Yes," he agreed, but he kept her hand for a moment. "Susan, I want to do this properly. Whatever this is, I want to do it right." "I know you do," she said. She squeezed his hand once and let go and went to her room, and she lay awake for an hour in the dark, smiling at the ceiling like a complete fool, and she did not mind it one bit. The next morning she found Pete Aldridge in the kitchen helping himself to the biscuits she had just brought out of the oven, which was a liberty he took regularly, and that she had long since stopped pretending to object to. He looked at her face with the acute perceptiveness of someone who was 23 and had been waiting for precisely this for approximately 5 months, and his whole expression became illuminated. "Well," he said. "Not a word," Susan said. "Miss Dalton, I would not dream of it," Pete said, with an air of such elaborate innocence that she picked up the dish towel and threw it at him. Monroe came in from the barn 20 minutes later, and when he looked at Susan, he did not look different in any outward way. He was the same measured, contained man he had always been, but there was something in the set of his expression, a warmth behind the careful composure, that was new and unmistakable. He poured his own coffee from the pot on the stove, which was not a thing he usually did. He usually waited for her to bring it to him, and he sat at the end of the preparation table and opened his ledger and said without looking up, "Morning, Susan." "Morning, Monroe," she said, and turned back to her stove. Behind them both, from his position near the biscuit basket, Pete Aldridge smiled so broadly that he had to look down at the floor to hide it. At 6 o'clock, when the hands came in for breakfast, Monroe stood at the head of the table with his coffee cup and waited for them to settle. They looked at him with the attentive wariness of men who have worked for someone long enough to notice when something is different. "I want to mention something before breakfast," Monroe said. 8 faces watched him with various degrees of carefully neutral expression. "Miss Dalton has agreed to remain on as cook for the Double C." He paused in the way of someone who is delivering exactly the amount of information he has decided to deliver and no more. "She's just a cook, same as she's always been. I'd ask you all to continue treating her accordingly." The silence that followed this statement lasted approximately 4 seconds, and then every single one of the 8 ranch hands at the table smiled. Not in identical ways, because they were 8 different men with 8 different faces and dispositions, but with the same underlying quality, the same knowing, warmly delighted recognition of a situation that was obviously something considerably more than what had been described. Pete Aldridge looked at the table. Hector Reyes looked at the window. Clay and Emmett Voss looked at each other. Thomas Webb cleared his throat and studied his coffee cup. Jesse Park and Arlo Finn both suddenly found the grain of the tabletop extremely interesting. Dutch Coulter was the only one who was not quite quick enough, and his smile lingered a half-second too long before he pulled it under control. Monroe looked at his crew with the expression of a man who sees exactly what is happening and has chosen, with great deliberation, not to acknowledge it. "All right," he said. "Let's eat." Susan, standing in the kitchen doorway with the bread basket, heard the whole thing and felt an emotion that was so warm and layered and complicated that it took her a moment to identify it. It was happiness, she realized. Uncomplicated, present-tense happiness. She brought the bread to the table and met Monroe's eyes as she set it down, and something passed between them, small and swift and private, and she went back to the kitchen. From the dining room came the ordinary sounds of breakfast, the clink of cutlery and the murmur of conversation, and underneath it, low and irrepressible, the sound of Pete Aldridge laughing at something that Dutch Coulter said. And she knew exactly what the something was, and she did not mind it at all. December arrived with the first real cold of the season, and the ranch settled into the slower, interior rhythms of winter mending, preparation, the necessary work of maintaining a large operation through the months when the land demanded less, but the equipment and the animals required more attention. Monroe began courting Susan Dalton in the winter of 1878 with the same deliberate care and respect that characterized everything he did, and he did it in the way of a man who had thought carefully about the woman he was courting and had adapted himself accordingly. He did not bring her flowers, because flowers in December in West Texas were a practical impossibility. He brought her a new set of kitchen knives from a cutlery merchant in San Angelo, properly balanced and of excellent steel, and she held them with the reverence of a craftsperson receiving exactly the right tool. He asked her to come with him to Crestfall on a Sunday, which was the hands' day off and Monroe's as well, and they drove the wagon into town together with the specific deliberateness of people who have decided to be seen together in public and understand the full implications of that. Crestfall was a small community, and the appearance of Monroe Carson driving into town on a Sunday with his cook on the seat beside him, and the way they spoke to each other in front of the general store, the ease and warmth of it, the way Monroe helped her down from the wagon with a hand that lingered in hers that did not immediately pull away, was observed, registered, and discussed with the enthusiastic thoroughness that small Texas towns devoted to interesting social developments. Mrs. Clara Holt, who ran the mercantile with her husband Ned and who had known Monroe Carson since he was a boy, watched them from behind her front window and allowed herself a long, satisfied smile. She had been watching Monroe Carson be alone for 2 years since his mother passed, and she had thought more than once that he was the sort of man who needed a particular kind of woman, someone with enough spine and substance to meet him on his own level. And as she watched Susan Dalton walk into the general store beside him and say something that made him actually laugh, Clara Holt noted, which was not a common occurrence, she thought that particular kind had apparently arrived. Monroe took Susan to the church Christmas social in mid-December, which was the nearest thing Crestfall had to a formal occasion, and they danced together in the church hall to the music of a fiddle and a badly tuned piano with the stiff, tentative quality of people who are not accustomed to dancing, but who very much want to be doing what they are doing. Monroe was not a graceful dancer, he was too self-conscious for grace, but he was a careful and attentive one, and he held her with a respectfulness that was also warmth, and Susan thought that this was, quite possibly, the best evening she had spent in years. "I'm not a very good dancer," he admitted. "I noticed," she said. "I could learn," he offered. "I'll teach you," she said, and his arm tightened slightly around her waist in a way that felt like a promise. On Christmas Day, the ranch was quieter than usual. Most of the hands had gone into Crestfall or to visit family elsewhere, and only Pete, Hector, and Thomas Webb remained on the property. Susan cooked a Christmas dinner that was an act of love disguised as a meal: roast beef and Yorkshire pudding and roasted potatoes and green beans, and a fruitcake she had been preparing since November. And they sat down to it, 5 of them at the table, and Monroe said grace with a brevity and sincerity that she found very moving. After dinner, when Pete and Hector and Thomas Webb had retired to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, and the winter dark was settled fully outside the windows, Monroe came to the kitchen for the last time that evening and found her at the table with her cookbook, making notes for January menus. He sat down across from her, which was by now their natural resting configuration, the 2 of them across the kitchen table with the lamplight between them. He reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the table between them. It was a ring. A simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it. The turquoise was the particular deep blue-green of the Texas sky on a clear November morning, and it was framed by 2 tiny scrolls of gold that gave it an elegance that was not extravagant but was entirely genuine. Susan looked at the ring, and then she looked at Monroe Carson, who was watching her with the most vulnerable expression she had ever seen on his face, open and honest and slightly braced, like someone who has placed a bet they very much want to win. "I am not a man who is very good with words," he said, "as you have had considerable opportunity to observe. But I know what I want, and I know how to work for what matters, and I know that you are—" He stopped briefly, organizing himself. "You are the first person in my adult life who has made this ranch feel like what it was when my mother was alive, like a place worth coming home to." He paused. "I would like to marry you, Susan, if you'll have me. I would like you to stay here not as a cook but as my wife." Susan Dalton looked at the ring on the kitchen table and felt something resolve inside her, some last careful holding back, the final residue of the self-protectiveness that had been her companion through 3 hard years of managing alone, and she felt it dissolve like the last of the winter frost under a March sun. "Monroe," she said. "Yes," he said. "You have been the most frustrating man to fall in love with," she said, "because you are so careful and so contained, and every time I thought I knew what you were thinking you turned out to be thinking something more and better than I had imagined. I will take that as a good sign," he said carefully. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." His breath went out slowly, and the braced quality left his face and was replaced by something that was purely and uncomplicatedly happy, and he reached across the table and took her hand and fitted the ring onto her finger, which it did perfectly. "I had it sized by Mrs. Holt," he said. "She guessed from the gloves you left at the Mercantile in November." Susan looked at the ring on her hand and then looked at him. "You've been planning this since November." "I've been planning this since August," he said, with the calm certainty of a man stating a fact. "I ordered the ring from a jeweler in San Antonio in September." "Monroe Carson," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood up from the table and came around it, and he stood to meet her, and she put her arms around him, and he held her with the same quality of deliberateness and warmth that he brought to everything, his chin resting on the top of her head and the winter wind moving outside the windows of the kitchen and the lamplight steady and warm, and she thought that she had been right back in May, when she had recognized the beginning of trouble. She had just been wrong about what kind. They were married in the Crestfall church on the second Saturday of February, 1879, in a ceremony that was brief and sincere, and attended by the entire population of the Double C Ranch, all 8 hands in their cleanest clothes, with their hats held respectfully, and their expressions carrying the particular satisfaction of people who have watched something they believed in come to pass. Pete Aldridge served as Monroe's best man, and spent the entire ceremony looking so pleased with himself that Monroe told him afterward, with great affection, to settle down. Clara Holt provided the reception, held in the church hall, and the whole of Crestfall turned out for it in the way that small communities turn out for celebrations, with enthusiasm and food, and a great deal of dancing. Monroe danced considerably better than he had at Christmas, having practiced in the kitchen on 3 subsequent Sunday evenings with Susan as his patient and amused instructor. Hector Reyes, who played the guitar with quiet virtuosity and had never mentioned it until Susan heard him in the bunkhouse one evening and expressed genuine amazement, played for the dancing, and the music he made was something that people who were there remembered for years. A sound that was neither purely Mexican nor purely Anglo, but something woven of both, which seemed right for a celebration in that particular corner of Texas in 1879. The months that followed the wedding were the best months that the Double C had ever known, by any measure that mattered. The ranch was productive and well managed, and the crew was the most settled and effective Monroe had ever assembled. And Susan Dalton Carson, she took his name with a quiet, deliberate pride, transformed the domestic life of the Double C into something that was genuinely, fully a home. She expanded the kitchen garden in the spring, adding a row of tomatoes and a section of herbs that made the kitchen smell, on warm days when the windows were open, extraordinary. She began keeping records of the ranch's supplies and expenses, with an organizational competence that Monroe discovered and examined with genuine admiration, and which led to a conversation about the ranch's accounts that revealed that Susan had a natural and acute understanding of financial management, an ability she had developed out of necessity in Abilene, and had never had occasion to apply in any formal way. Monroe, without making a production of it, began including her in his business decisions. Not because it was expected of him. It was not, in 1879 Texas, but because her thinking was clear and her judgment was sound, and he was a practical man who valued competence wherever he found it, and was not interested in excluding his best counsel from any room simply because the convention of the time suggested he should. The hands adapted to this without comment, which was itself a kind of statement. When Susan said something at the dinner table about the north pasture needing better drainage before the next rainy season, they nodded and thought about it seriously, because they had learned over the previous year that Susan Dalton's observations about the ranch were worth treating seriously. In the summer of 1879, Hector Reyes came to Monroe with the careful, formal manner of someone raising a significant subject, and told him that he was thinking of leaving the Double C. He was 32 years old, he had been saving his wages for 4 years, and he had the opportunity to purchase a small piece of land east of Crestfall, not cattle land, but farming land, the kind that could sustain a family. He wanted to bring his mother up from Chihuahua. He wanted to build something. Monroe shook his hand and told him he had earned every bit of it. Susan sent him away with 3 jars of preserved peaches and the recipe for his favorite biscuits, written out in her clear hand on a piece of paper that Hector folded carefully and kept in his shirt pocket. They hired a new hand in Hector's place, a young man from a ranch near Fredericksburg named Samuel Bright, who was 20 years old and capable and eager, and who was introduced to the Double C's dining table and its remarkable cuisine with results that were entirely predictable. Samuel Bright ate his first supper at the Double C Ranch and looked up at the end of it with the expression of a man encountering a previously unknown natural wonder. "Lord Almighty," he said with complete sincerity. The table laughed and Susan shook her head and Pete Aldridge clapped Samuel Bright on the shoulder and said, "Welcome to the Double C, son." By autumn of 1879, Susan knew she was expecting a child. She told Monroe on a Tuesday evening in October, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, in the matter-of-fact way of a woman who processes important news through the practical, and he was so still for a moment that she wondered if she had misjudged his reaction. And then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his with such deliberateness and such care that she felt something in her chest expand to an almost painful degree. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. He held her hands for a long time in a silence that was full of things he was feeling but was, characteristically, finding his way toward the words for. "I'm going to need to improve on the ranch house," he said finally. "There's time," she said. "I want the room next to ours to be ready well before," he said. "I'll write to San Antonio for proper furniture, Monroe, and I want Dr. Pendleton in Crestfall involved from the beginning. He's a good physician, Monroe, and you'll need more help in the kitchen. I'll ask around, Monroe," she said, and he stopped. She was smiling. "Take a breath." He looked at her with those amber-brown eyes, and behind the practical planning that was his emotional language, she could see the enormity of what he was feeling, the joy of it, and the depth of it, and the slight terrified quality of love that has grown into something much larger than you originally intended. He was, she realized with great tenderness, completely undone by the news, and was managing it the only way he knew how, through lists and plans and the reassuring discipline of things that could be organized and acted upon. "All right," he said. "I'm taking a breath." "Good," she said. "Now say what you actually want to say." He was quiet for a moment and then, "I am the happiest man in the state of Texas," he said, with the simple certainty of someone stating something they have never been more sure of. She squeezed his hands. "That will do," she said. The news of Susan's condition traveled through the ranch hands with the speed that important domestic news always traveled through small, close-knit communities, and the response was immediate and warm. Pete Aldridge expressed his feelings by appearing in the kitchen the following morning with a cedar box he had made in the bunkhouse during winter evenings. A beautifully constructed little chest with jointed corners and a fitted lid that he had clearly been working on for some time. He set it on the kitchen table without explanation, touched his hat, and went back to work, and Susan had to be very firm with herself about her composure. Thomas Webb, who was the eldest and who had the wisdom that came from having lived through considerable loss and found his way back to something good, sought out Monroe in the barn and said only this: "Congratulations, Monroe. Your mother would have been very proud." And Monroe nodded and said, "Thank you, Thomas," and neither of them said anything more about it. But Monroe stood for a while after Thomas left with his hand on his horse's flank and his head slightly bowed, and whatever he was thinking or feeling in that moment was his own. The winter of 1879 passed slowly and warmly inside the Double C Ranch house. Monroe made the improvements he had promised, and the room next to theirs became a proper nursery, furnished simply but with great care. Susan continued cooking, at a pace that Monroe monitored with anxious attention that she found both touching and occasionally exasperating, and she remained stubbornly, enviably healthy throughout her pregnancy, which Dr. Pendleton attributed to her robust constitution, and Monroe attributed to sheer force of will. In March of 1880, on a morning when the first warm suggestion of spring was moving through the south pastures, and the pecan trees outside the ranch house were beginning to bud, Susan gave birth to a boy. He was born just after dawn, with the calm efficiency of someone who had already decided to be cooperative. And when Monroe was finally allowed into the room and saw Susan in the bed with their son in her arms, he stopped in the doorway, and something crossed his face that was so complete and so stripped of everything but love that she thought she had never seen any human being look exactly like that before. He came to the bed and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the same careful, deliberate quality that he brought to everything he cared about. And the look on his face was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen in her life. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. Monroe looked at the baby for a long time. The baby, for his part, looked back at Monroe with the unfocused but serious expression of the very newly arrived, apparently finding this large, amber-eyed man a subject worthy of consideration. "James," Monroe said. "For my father," he paused, "and Thomas as a second name if you agree." "James Thomas Carson," Susan said. "Yes, that's exactly right." Monroe looked up at her, and she saw everything in his expression, the gratitude and the love and the magnitude of the moment. And she reached up and touched his face briefly with her hand, and he turned his head just enough to press his lips against her palm. Outside the room, down the hall, Pete Aldridge was sitting on the porch steps in the early morning light, having waited there since the previous evening, and when Monroe opened the front door and appeared on the porch, Pete looked up and read his face in an instant. "A boy," Pete said. "A boy," Monroe said. Pete Aldridge stood up from the porch steps and shook Monroe's hand with a grip that was about considerably more than a handshake, and Monroe held onto it for a moment. And then Pete went to the bunkhouse to tell the others, and you could hear, a few minutes later, the sound of 8 men expressing genuine collective joy. Young James Thomas Carson grew through his first year with a speed and solidity that satisfied the doctor and delighted everyone at the Double C Ranch. He was a sociable baby, curious and good-natured, and possessed of a deep seriousness of expression that was unmistakably his father's and a bright, direct gaze that was unmistakably his mother's. He was, in practice, raised by an entire ranch as much as by 2 parents passed from hand to hand at mealtimes, watched over by 8 men who competed quietly for the privilege of carrying him to the kitchen garden and back, and who taught him, in his earliest mobile months, to love horses and wide-open spaces and the particular quality of the West Texas sky. Pete Aldridge was his unofficial godfather in everything but ceremony, and the bond between them was the kind of bond that forms between a very good-natured young man and a baby who finds him reliably entertaining, and who is taught, by the time he is 2, to say Pete's name with a clarity that produced in Pete an expression of satisfaction, so profound that Monroe told Susan privately that he had never seen the man look so accomplished. By the spring of 1881, Susan discovered she was expecting again, and this time Monroe received the news with considerably more equilibrium, the same depth of feeling, but without the urgent inventory of practical preparations, or rather, with the preparations already largely in place, which allowed him to begin with what he actually wanted to say, which was that he loved her and was the happiest man alive in that order, and said it clearly and without preamble. And Susan kissed him for it. This second baby arrived in November of 1881, a girl this time, with dark eyes and a disposition that made her opinions on every subject she encountered extremely clear from the very beginning. They named her Eleanor Grace, for Monroe's mother, whose name had been Eleanor, and for the Grace that Susan had always believed was a quality worth naming children after. Eleanor Grace Carson turned out to be a person of formidable character, which became clear very early, and which everyone at the Double C observed with a combination of affection and mild alarm. She was nothing like her brother James, who was thoughtful and methodical, and who approached the world with his father's careful deliberateness. Eleanor approached the world as if she had somewhere important to be, and the world had better keep up. She was, Monroe told Susan one evening, watching their daughter conduct herself with remarkable authority over a wooden horse toy and a long-suffering Pete Aldridge, the most alarming and the most wonderful child he had ever encountered. "She gets it from somewhere," Susan said. Monroe looked at her with his steady amber eyes. "I know exactly where she gets it," he said, and there was nothing in his tone but pure admiration. The years at the Double C settled into the particular rhythms of a full and purposeful life. The ranch continued to thrive under Monroe's management, expanding in the mid-1880s to include additional acreage to the east that allowed for larger cattle operations, and, at Susan's suggestion, a small orchard of peach and pecan trees that Monroe had dismissed initially as decorative and came to regard, by their first productive season, as one of the better decisions he had made. The orchard produced reliably and abundantly, and Susan's preserved peaches became a product that Clara Holt stocked at the Mercantile and sold with steady enthusiasm. The ranch hands changed over the years as people moved on and new ones came, but there was a core that remained, Pete Aldridge, who proved disinclined to seek his fortune elsewhere when his fortune appeared to be doing quite well exactly where it was, managing the Double C's day-to-day operations with a competence that grew with every passing year. Thomas Webb, who stayed until he was 60 and then retired to a small house in Crestfall that Monroe helped him purchase, and who came back to the ranch for Sunday dinners with a regularity that made him feel, in all the ways that mattered, like he had never really left. Hector Reyes established his farm east of town and did well with it, bringing his mother up from Chihuahua as he had planned. She was a small, fierce woman named Consuelo who arrived with an opinion of everyone she met, and a recipe for mole that she shared with Susan in a memorable kitchen session during which neither of them spoke much of the other's language, but communicated with complete success through the universal language of food and mutual respect. Hector visited the Double C on holidays and brought vegetables from his farm, and his mother and Susan corresponded occasionally in writing, Consuelo in Spanish and Susan in English, each reading the other's letters with the help of a dictionary and the willingness to work at understanding. There were difficulties in those years, because there are always difficulties in the years that matter most. In 1883, a drought hit West Texas with the merciless thoroughness that the region's droughts had, and the Double C lost cattle and pasture, and several months' income in a way that required hard decisions and harder patience. Monroe managed it with the contained, unflappable quality that Susan had come to understand as one of his great strengths. He did not panic and he did not overreact, and he made the necessary cuts with fairness and transparency, and he kept every hand on through the worst of it by restructuring wages temporarily in a way that he made up for fully when the rains came back. Susan managed the household through the drought with equal discipline, finding ways to feed everyone well on reduced resources that required a creativity she had not previously been required to exercise and that she found, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely engaging. The cook wagon for the smaller operation went out leaner but still good, and when Pete Aldridge told one of the new hands during the drought year that the cook at the Double C could make a feast out of dried beans and yesterday's bread, and have you believing it was intentional all along, he was not exaggerating. James Thomas Carson grew through his childhood into an 11-year-old who was quiet and serious, and who had learned to ride before he could read properly, and who showed every sign of becoming the kind of rancher his father was: methodical, fair, with a deep and unhurried relationship with the land and the animals on it. He followed Monroe around the ranch with an earnest attention that Monroe received with a gruff and barely concealed delight, teaching him without lectures, but through the long, patient education of doing things together and explaining as you went. Eleanor Grace Carson, at 9, was already a personality so large that the ranch felt, on her most energetic days, genuinely insufficient to contain her. She was brilliant in a scattered, explosive way, consumed by things for weeks, and then on to the next, reading everything she could find with a ferocity that caused Monroe to establish a correspondence with a bookseller in Dallas who sent regular parcels. She wanted to know how everything worked and would not accept explanations that she found unconvincing, a trait that Monroe told her, privately and honestly, was one of the finest qualities a person could have. She also, Susan noted with the amusement of someone who recognized a familiar pattern, had her father's stubbornness and her father's difficulty in saying directly what she felt, which manifested in Alina's case not as careful containment but as volume. She shouted what she felt rather than withholding it, which Susan reflected was probably a healthier approach, and which Monroe found both exhausting and quietly funny. In the spring of 1885, Pete Aldridge appeared at the kitchen door one evening with his hat in his hands and a self-consciousness entirely uncharacteristic in a man who had been doing exactly this for 7 years. "Pete," Susan said, looking at his face. "What's happened?" "Nothing bad," he said quickly. "Nothing bad, I promise." He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, turning his hat in his hands the way Monroe had done, years ago, on the evening he had asked if he could join her on the porch. "There's a woman in Crestfall," he said, "the new school teacher. Her name is Alice Brand, and she came out from Missouri in January, and she has brown hair and she talks about books, and she is. He stopped. "Yes," Susan said. "She is the most interesting person I have ever met," he said, "and I don't know what to do about it." Susan sat down across from him with her tea and looked at this man who had been the first friendly face she had seen at the Double C, who had smiled his knowing smile at her the day she arrived and had been smiling it for 7 years, and she felt an enormous and thoroughly domestic wave of affection for him. "Pete Aldridge," she said. "Tell me about her." He told her with the incoherent enthusiasm of someone who has not had the opportunity to say any of these things out loud yet, and Susan listened with complete attention and asked questions in the right places and refilled his coffee, and by the end of it Pete looked lighter and steadier and more like himself. "Go call on her," Susan said. "Take her something. Not flowers, the school garden is full of flowers. Take her a book." "What kind of book?" Susan thought about it. "Ask her what she's already read. What does she teach?" "She teaches everything. She's the only teacher." "Then ask her what she liked to read when she was learning and find something that builds on that." She paused. "That's what Monroe did for me. It works." Pete stared at her. "The cookbook. He ordered it in June and waited until October for it to arrive," Susan said. "It worked very well." Pete was quiet for a moment, and then he began to smile, the same smile she had first seen on the day she arrived, broad and knowing and entirely human. "All right," he said. "All right, I'll try." He courted Alice Brand with the same earnest, enthusiastic attention he brought to everything. And Alice Brand, who was 26 and had come from Missouri with a determined independence and a genuine love of this wild, enormous country she had chosen, accepted his attention with a directness and wit that delighted Pete and alarmed him equally, and which Monroe told Susan reminded him, with a private and amused familiarity, of someone else he knew. Pete Aldridge and Alice Brand were married in Crestfall in October of 1885, and Susan baked their wedding cake herself. A proper layered cake with dried fruit and buttercream frosting that she had been planning since Pete's evening visit in the spring, because she had known, watching his face, exactly where that conversation was going. The Double C hosted the wedding reception at the ranch, and it was the kind of evening that people remember, the West Texas sky going through its full repertoire of colors as the sun went down, tables set up on the lawn in the mild October evening, food and music, and the easy warmth of people who know each other well and are glad to be together. Monroe danced with Susan that evening to the music of 3 fiddles and a guitar, and he danced considerably better than he had at their own reception 6 years earlier, which she told him, and he said that he had had a good teacher, and she said that he had been an excellent student, and he pulled her a little closer and they danced in the Texas evening, and it was, she thought, A very fine thing to be alive and in this place, and with this man. The years that followed were full in all the ways that mattered. The Double C continued to grow and evolve with the changing economics of the West Texas cattle industry, navigating the shifts of the late 1880s. The expansion of the railroads that changed the cattle drives, the opening of new markets, the consolidation of land among larger operators, with the steady intelligence that Monroe brought to it, and the financial discipline that Susan had long since made her contribution to. Working now openly and without apology as Monroe's equal in the management of the ranch's business affairs, a fact that was unremarkable to the people who knew them and occasionally surprising to those who encountered them for the first time. James, at 14, was already more ranch hand than child, working alongside the men and learning the operation with a seriousness and competence that Monroe watched with a quiet pride that he expressed through increased responsibility and reduced supervision, which James understood correctly as the highest form of his father's praise. Eleanor, at 12, had decided she wanted to be a doctor, which she announced at supper one evening with complete confidence, and Monroe had said nothing for a moment, and then said that she would need considerable more education, and Susan had said that could be arranged, and that had been that. It was not, in 1887, a straightforward ambition for a girl in West Texas, and both her parents knew it, and neither of them said so, because they also knew their daughter, and the last thing Eleanor Grace Carson needed from either of them was a reason to become more determined than she already was. Pete and Alice Aldridge had a son in 1886, whom they named Henry, and a daughter in 1888, named for Alice's mother. The two families were, by this point, intertwined in all the practical and emotional ways that close neighbors become intertwined over years of shared work and meals and crises managed together, and the children of both households moved between the two properties with the freedom of the thoroughly at home. In 1889, on the occasion of their 10th wedding anniversary, Monroe Carson did something that he had been planning, in his characteristic fashion, for considerably longer than the occasion required. He had the ranch house expanded, adding a proper library to the south side of the house, with shelves built to Susan's specifications, and a south-facing window that let in the afternoon light in the particular way that was best for reading. And he filled the shelves with books acquired over the course of 18 months through the Dallas bookseller, and through correspondence with a librarian in Austin, whom Susan had never met but who had, on Monroe's behalf, assembled a collection that was remarkable for its range and quality. He showed her the library on the morning of their anniversary, brought her there with his hands over her eyes and removed them at the doorway, and she stood in the threshold of this room that had been built for her and filled for her and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Monroe Carson," she said finally. "Yes," he said from behind her. She turned to face him. He was standing with his arms crossed in the way he stood when he was slightly nervous about something, and his face wore the expression of someone who has made an offering and is waiting to learn if it landed well. "You are the most extraordinary man," she said. Something moved through his expression, relief and happiness, and the particular warmth that came to his face when she said something that reached him. "It needed a library," he said. "The house has needed one for years." "It has," she agreed. "Thank you." She kissed him in the doorway of the library on their 10th anniversary, and he held her the way he had held her since the beginning, with deliberateness and warmth and complete certainty. And through the library's new south window, the morning sun came in at the exact angle that illuminated everything with the particular amber light of a West Texas autumn morning, and the ranch stretched out beyond it in all directions, alive and well tended and theirs. That evening they had supper with Pete and Alice and their children and Thomas Webb, who had come up from Crestfall for the occasion, and James and Eleanor, and the table was crowded and loud and beautiful, and Susan's cooking was what it had always been, generous and skilled and made with love that was present in every element of it, not as sentiment but as craft, the way the best love always is. Monroe sat at the head of the table and looked at what was assembled around it, and Susan, watching him from the kitchen doorway before she brought out the last of the dishes, saw something on his face that she recognized as the expression of a man who has what he wanted and knows it fully, and is not taking it for granted. She brought the dishes to the table and sat beside him, and he reached under the table and took her hand in his, and held it while Thomas Webb said grace. And then he let go and they ate, all of them together, talking and laughing and filling the house with the ordinary, extraordinary sounds of people who know each other well and are glad to be exactly where they are. After supper, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the kitchen was clean, Susan sat in the new library with a lamp and her newest book, and Monroe came in and sat across from her with his ledger, and the room was quiet and full and warm. "Monroe," she said, without looking up from her book. "Yes," he said, without looking up from his ledger. "Do you remember," she said, "the morning I arrived? You were in the barn with the bay gelding and Pete brought me in, and you said the hands ate at 6 and 6 and no complaining about early mornings." "I remember," he said. "You looked at me like you were assessing a fence line," she said. A pause. "I was nervous," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with his steady amber eyes, a slight and genuine amusement in his expression. "You were, considerably," he said. "You were not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected a cook," he said. "I got considerably more than I bargained for." She held his gaze. "Is that a complaint?" "The opposite of a complaint," he said, with the simple, certain quality that was entirely him, and went back to his ledger. Susan went back to her book, and the lamp burned steady, and outside the library window the West Texas night was vast and full of stars, and the Double C Ranch breathed around them. The horses in the barn, the cattle in the distant pastures, the house full of sleeping children, and 10 years of life well built, and it was right and whole and entirely, completely good. Years later, when James was running the northern operation of the ranch and Alina had gone east to study medicine with the fierce determination she brought to everything, and when Pete and Alice's children were grown and Pete had become something close to a partner in the Double C's management, and when the house had acquired more years and more history, and the kitchen garden had grown so full and established, it seemed like something that had always been there and always would be years later. People in Crestfall who knew the Carsons would sometimes try to identify the moment when it had become clear to everyone that Monroe Carson and his cook were something considerably more than employer and employee. Most of them, when they thought about it carefully, could not actually identify a single moment. It was more like the way the light changed in West Texas in the late afternoon, gradually and then all at once, golden and warm and obvious once you saw it. It was like that. It had always been there, and then one day you noticed it was there, and then it seemed like it had always been and always would be exactly as it was. Clara Holt, who had known Monroe Carson since he was a boy, and who had watched Susan Dalton walk into the mercantile beside him that first Sunday in December of 1878, said that she had known from that moment. But when pressed for specifics, she always said the same thing. It was the way he looked at her when she was not looking at him, like she was something he was very glad to know was in the world, and like he intended to spend a considerable amount of time making sure she knew it. And Susan, when she was older and her children asked her to tell the story, James asking with the composed attentiveness that was so like his father, Alina asking with the direct intensity that was entirely her own, Susan always started the story the same way, with the borrowed mule and the carpetbag and the cast iron skillet and the enormous Texas sky. And she always ended it the same way too. Not at the wedding, or the first kiss, or the library, or any of the moments that were large and obvious. She ended it with Monroe Carson standing at the head of the breakfast table on a morning in the first winter she was at the ranch, telling 8 ranch hands that their new cook was just a cook, nothing more to see, she was just a cook, and every single one of those men smiling with everything they knew, which was more than Monroe had said and exactly what was true. "That's when I knew," she would say. "Knew what?" Alina would ask. That this was home, Susan would say. That these were my people. That I wasn't going anywhere. And Monroe, who was usually somewhere in the room when she told this story, would say nothing, but would look at her with those amber-brown eyes and the expression that was warmth itself, the expression that had taken her 3 months to earn and had been looking at her ever since, steady and certain and full. The Double C Ranch stood for generations. The land did what good land does when it is tended by people who love it. It gave back. The pecan trees grew tall and reliable. The kitchen garden spread. The library filled up. The house added rooms as it needed to, and the generations that moved through it added their particular marks. James's precise handwriting in the ranch ledgers he took over from his father. Alina's medical texts stacked on every available surface during her rare visits home. The photographs that began appearing on the walls in the 1890s as photography became more available, recording the faces of the people who had made this place what it was. There is a photograph taken in 1892 in the yard of the Double C that shows Monroe and Susan Carson on the porch steps. Monroe is 54, gray at the temples now, with the weathered quality of a man who has spent decades in the sun and wind of West Texas. Susan is 40, with the kind of face that has grown more itself over the years, the intelligence and directness of it more apparent, more settled into its character. They are not posed dramatically. Monroe has his hand on the railing and Susan is turned slightly toward him, and they are both looking at something outside the frame of the photograph. One of the children, probably, or something happening in the yard, and neither of them is performing for the camera. But the way she is turned toward him, and the way he is standing, just slightly angled in her direction, it is visible, even in the flat black and white of a photograph from 1892, in the imprecise and beautiful way that real things are visible even when they are not the subject of the picture. It is the way people stand when they have been standing next to each other for a long time and have stopped being aware that they are doing it, because it has become as natural as breathing. It is the way people stand when they are home. Monroe Carson died in 1911, having lived long enough to see both his children established and his grandchildren born, having worked his land to the last reasonable day, and having spent the winter of his final year in the library he had built for Susan, reading alongside her in the afternoons with the comfortable companionship of people who have spent 30 years perfecting the art of being in the same room. He died in February, in the bedroom of the house he had lived in all his life, with Susan beside him, and his last clear words, the words she kept and returned to and measured everything against for the rest of her life, were the same words he had said to her in the kitchen on the evening of their 10th anniversary, the opposite of a complaint. Susan Dalton Carson lived to 1921, long enough to see the world change into something her younger self would not have recognized, long enough to see Alina come home from her medical practice in Austin and set up a proper surgery in Crestfall, long enough to see James's son take the Double C into its next generation, with the same careful, deliberate hands that ran through all the men of that family like a watermark. She lived in the house with the library and the kitchen garden and the east-facing window in her room that she had first looked out of in May of 1878, and she cooked until she was 82, because cooking was not a job she had left behind but a practice she had carried all her life, and she fed her family and her neighbors and anyone who needed feeding with the same generous, skilled attention she had brought to the Double C's kitchen on her very first evening. When 8 hungry men had gone quiet with reverence over her biscuits and her stew, she was, in every document and record that survived, listed as Susan Dalton Carson of the Double C Ranch. But if you asked Pete Aldridge, who outlived them both and who told this story to his grandchildren, and to anyone else who would listen, he would tell you that the most accurate thing ever said about Susan Dalton Carson was said by Monroe on a February morning in 1879 at the breakfast table. In the most technically truthful and completely inadequate description, he had ever offered of the most important person in his life. She was just a cook. And every single ranch hand at that table had smiled, because every single one of them had known since May, since the first supper, since the morning Monroe started taking his coffee in the kitchen, exactly what she was. She was the heart of it. She was the whole thing. She was home.